The ambassador is a graduate of Tbilisi State University, where he taught in the Department of International Relations and Law for a number of years. He received his PhD from the Institute for USA and Canada in the Academy of Sciences of the USSR, very prestigious institution. He was affiliated with that from 1974 to 1989. Very interesting years, during which he wrote a couple of books, the titles of which I like. White House, Mechanism of Decision Making. And he was co-author of a book, American Political Institutions, History in the Current State. I probably should have asked him to talk about the mystery of American policy making. He's participated in a number of conferences, of course, and he's written for academic journals. In 1989, a different existence began, as you know, and he served in several positions in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Georgia, including Vice Chairman of the Council for UNESCO Affairs, Head of the Political Department, Deputy Foreign Minister, First Deputy Foreign Minister, and from 92 to 94, the National Security Advisor to the Head of State. And of course, he has served now as the Ambassador of Georgia to the United States. So he brings in, and I should mention that he also has, I never do this, but his hobbies are interesting: jazz music, history, and basketball. And of course, you have to wait all year for the NBA season to become interesting, but now it is, and we get to witness the Bulls and the upstarts from Utah, and so for someone who likes basketball, it's an interesting time of the year. But the ambassador brings a scholar's background. We've all been impressed by the quality of education within the USSR. Their intellectual community has been absolutely superb. He's been at the very center of a prestigious institution and now is participating in the practical affairs of his state. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to present to you Ambassador Japaridze.
Thank you very much. It's really great pleasure to be here in Baltimore with my wife, who is sitting somewhere down there. It's a lovely city, and I mentioned to some of my friends that it's always good to come by to Baltimore from Washington, from this also lovely but sometimes very tough, city, especially when you are ambassador. So I appreciate this opportunity to be with you this evening, and there are several reasons why I appreciate this, because for the first time, I think, and my wife could confirm this, my very easy name was pronounced appropriately, and it's really honor and privilege for me. So I came as an ambassador to Washington in 1994. Good evening. 1994, and I should say that by that time the Washington policymakers, they knew, where Georgia was, but for general public, Georgia was, terra incognita. And I remember one of my first lunches, and as I remember it properly, it was, lunch with somebody from Brown and Root. It's, very huge and big pipeline company, and by that time, in 1994, we already started and became part of this very active and very sensitive, delicate game of pipelines, through the Caucasus. And when this vice president from Brown and Root, mentioned, and it was 1994, and it was when Republicans, got Congress, and they were very powerful, and especially, Speaker Newt Gingrich. And when this vice president of Brown and Root mentioned to his wife that he's going to have a lunch, with an ambassador from Georgia, her instant reaction was, look at this Newt Gingrich. He already managed to appoint his own ambassador. And by that time in 1994, I did not deny it, which I'm doing now. So there are many, many changes, since that time, and today I'd like to talk about my country, Georgia, and I'd like to talk about the region which Georgia is part of, and I'll try to somehow to talk and share with you some ideas, what kind of, trends and processes are going in this part of the world. And when we talk about this part of the world, and we talked about this, just during the reception, I should say that it's not that far away. We are not talking about geography and biological time, but what I like to say and communicate to you, and if I succeed, I'll be the happiest person in the world, that this has become, the part of American foreign policy making. It makes no difference how far we are. So anytime I communicate this story about my country, I always start my talk with, in my opinion, fascinating historical facts about Georgia. Georgians became a Christian country. Christianity reached Georgia in the 2nd century, and it became, official religion in the 4th century. The first Jews came to Georgia 26 centuries ago. 26 centuries ago, and in 1998, in September this year, we'll be celebrating this, I should say, incredible anniversary, and a lot of guests from different parts of the world will be visiting my country, and this will be a really exciting, I hope, event. When we speak about Georgia, I'd like to mention also that if we speak about Georgian language, Georgian alphabet is one of among 16 existing alphabets in the world. It's a unique alphabet. And we always are proud mentioning these facts, to our friends, to the different audiences. And I always start my presentation about my country and the region from this, in my opinion, fascinating historical facts. And I'm extremely pleased to have this opportunity to share with you today some views, or to be fair, some general snapshots of Georgia, the South Caucasus, as I mentioned, extremely dynamic but still quite turbulent region, central component of which, at least geographically, if you look at the map, my country is. This will be a very modest attempt to elaborate upon really fascinating developments that have already created unique space of political, trade, and commercial activities, cultural and scientific exchanges, and which covers, I mean, these activities, the South Caucasus, composed of Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Central Asia, the Black Sea basin countries, Israel, Moldova. I'd like to mention our immediate neighbors, Russia, big neighbors, Russia, Iran, Turkey. And having mentioned this, I should say that it's really extremely fascinating, one more time to mention, fascinating and very dynamic, region and space. All of us still face a number of our unresolved problems within the region, as well as uncamouflaged ambitions and attempts to influence these developments from outside powers. But without any doubts, this space offers extraordinary perspectives and opportunities. And very good friend of my country and entire South Caucasus, Senator Brownback from Kansas, calls the projects pipelines, and there are a lot of projects besides pipelines, communications, and we call this corridor, Euro-Asian corridor, which incorporates in itself, besides pipelines, different projects in connection with constructing highways, communications, and others. And Senator Brownback calls this corridor of freedom. And in my opinion, this is superb, definition, but I would say that it's a little bit too premature, because everything in this region is still embryonic and fragmental. Just a couple of words about my country, about Georgia. I think, William Courtney, former American ambassador to Georgia, and now he works at the White House and is one of the senior advisors to President Clinton, has summed up the most accurately the relative progress made by Georgia in the recent years. As Mr. Courtney put it, Georgia is not a risk anymore. Georgia is an opportunity. This does not mean that we do not have problems. They still exist. For example, one of the regions of Georgia, if you are familiar with the processes in that part of the world, Abkhazia which is a separatist region, and there are certain forces trying to get this piece of territory from Georgia. This part of my country is a painful sore for us, and there are a variety of smaller but nonetheless destabilizing problems impeded our efforts to build strong national economy and consolidate effective national government. Corruption is still, I will confess, still high, and that creates tense public sentiments. Yes, we have gone and still are going through a very painful transitional period. But today, I could say that Georgia has found its niche. Only a couple of years ago, some experts wrote about Georgia as just one of the former Soviet republics, hopelessly mired in economic decline and social turmoil. Our democratic credentials were challenged, and few international businesses were attracted to our country. Some kept lamenting that Georgia would collapse back into it, where it had been forced to for more than 70 years ago, a distant outpost of the Russian vast empire, well known for Georgian wines and cheeses that provided the meager Soviet cuisine, than the vitality and intellect of its remarkable people. But what a difference a few years of hard work, goodwill, and some luck can make. Since 1996, the Georgian economy is growing by about 12%, and I'm very proud that and London economists called my country among emerging tigers, speaking about economic trends in Georgia. Visitors to Georgia, especially those who've been coming at regular intervals, never fail to notice these positive changes. New businesses emerging daily, increasing number of expensive foreign cars on the highways, smiles are back on the faces of Georgians. People strolling in the streets look a lot more stylish than only 1 year ago. However, there still is a question answer to which they are all eager to know. Will this continue? What are the sources of stability that can guarantee the continuation of the reforms? And I'd like to just list down some of our assets. First of all, Georgian Constitution, and adoption of which, I should say, was an extraordinary accomplishment. The Constitution provides for a strict separation of powers and an effective system of checks and balances. And together with the Constitutional Court, it provides legal, very solid foundation of my state. Second, President. I think the name of my President, President Japaridze, who is one of the most prominent leaders of all the political figures in the world, and just yesterday I had privilege to participate in a very emotional ceremony awarding Mr. Japaridze with a prize for peace and nation building by the New York East-West Institute, and a lot of dignitaries and a lot of celebrities participated in this very emotional and interesting event, and a lot of interesting words being said about my president. Georgian Parliament, this is really very young, aggressive, ambitious, reform-minded parliament, and this parliament has proved to be a guarantor of stability and creator of environment necessary for carrying out further reforms. And today, lawmakers seem to concentrate on legislative activities rather than on partisan skirmishes and personal vendettas. The parliament has passed, and it's also fascinating, statistics, has passed more than 300 of the most vital legislative acts since 1995. When we speak about guarantees, I'd like to mention, besides some physical, things like constitution, presidential institution, and the parliament, the mentality of my people, and this naive romanticism of the first years of independence gave its way to pragmatic attitudes. Every Georgian mentality today is essentially immune to radical slogans. The next guarantee, next point, is middle-class psychology. However incredible it might sound, given the unusually low income of the majority of population, Georgia has numerous middle class, which is a significant factor of the future economic stability. It is wrong to define the middle class solely in terms of current incomes. It is middle class psychology that really matters along such things as property ownership. The psychology, at least in Georgia, was inherited from the communist past, and in fact was even further bolstered by privatization of the housing, which has turned the majority of the population into property owners. I'd like to also mention, social capital, when we speak about, future life in Georgia, vision of better life, and so on. So whenever I'm asked, what are the guarantees, of developments in Georgia, I always, mention these points. And concluding this brief story about Georgia, I would like also to mention one, in my opinion, very important and extremely interesting element in everyday life of Georgians. In In one of his speeches after 1995 elections, President Shevardnadze outlined that psychological and mental transformation of Georgian society, alongside with the creation of functioning democratic institutions and the drastic economic reforms, should be one of the fundamental long-term goals of his administration. Understandably, the protracted Soviet experiment that deprived individuals and entire nations of their basic rights resulted in the emergence of artificial reality that helped to develop mythology, which according to observers was to play a crucial part, first in dismantling Soviet Union and Soviet Empire, and later in securing the failure of a quick transformation. Let me offer just several of the most drastic examples in connection with the above mentioned. The nationalism. When we get rid of Soviet Empire and get rid of Soviet Union, we thought that nationalism is the cure of all social ills and tensions, and that the failure of communism would secure ultimate harmony in Georgia. It did not happen, unfortunately. Second, political unity on serious matters will never be difficult to achieve in post-communist Georgia, since the considerations of national interests will invariably outweigh partisan ambitions. Introduction of private property will work miracles overnight. We thought that way, but it did not happen again. Market forces, even unaided, will easily take care of all economic problems. The industrialized world is eagerly waiting for the opportunity to invest, and thus foreign investors will rush onto the scene as soon as communism falls. It did not happen. And international community and the NATO in particular, would act promptly to defend Georgia if there is a threat to her sovereignty or territorial integrity. It never happens. We're realists. There are also a couple of other beliefs: equation of democracy with anarchy, and that the consolidation of any state control is essentially vicious. Anything developed, oriented, or constructed under communist rule, either an institution, a social platform, or even work of art, even a building, ought to be destroyed. But what we witness today in Georgia, at least it seems that way to me, is a slow demolition of this mythology, beliefs, increasing awareness among the majority of Georgians that hard work, commitment to democratic values and economic reforms, though sometimes very painful and slow, with lots of zigzags, are the only way leading to becoming state and normal state. And I should say that the word commitment is the most appropriate word when we speak about today's Georgia. We understand that it's not an easygoing process. Here and there, we could still hear highly romanticized, it happens not only in Georgia, stories about, and we have ancient history in this respect, about, for example, recreation of Georgia of David the Builder. It was in the 12th century, famous Georgian king. And ironically, as some of my friends admit, at least in terms of energy, and we have terrible sometimes, especially in winter times, terrible shortage of energy. And when we speak about David the Builder, the king of 12th century, in terms of energy supply, this prophecy did come true in recent years. Candlelight dinners in Georgia became an unfortunate necessity rather than a romantic whim, I should say. Above, I recalled and mentioned Ambassador Courtney's words that Georgia has become an opportunity, and this opportunity lies at a critical juncture of space and time in the new Eurasia. When one looks at the Soviet-era map, Georgia looks like a little territory of fixed borders surrounded by other territories whose borders are also fixed, forbidding. It appears on political maps as it was a southern extremity of a huge empire, a distant point on a north-south axis, That deep purple line that marked the end of Soviet space conditioned us to look northward for the center of gravity. And I suspect that if somebody from the outer space makes the same observation from their spaceships high in the sky, we'll see something very different today. They do not see borders drawn in deep purple ink, first of all. They do not see the Soviet Empire. They do not see Georgia as a kind of Russian Florida or Russian California, or there is Russian California, by the way. The Georgia they see is not an outpost. Rather, it is a heartland, and it is not the end of something, but rather a centerpiece. It is not a terminus, but corridor that links much of the rest of Eurasia in diverse and wonderful ways. This Georgia, the real Georgia, is one of the essential keys to unlocking the riches of Eurasia. Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, Mediterranean-like capital, and you've been there in 1983, and there are a lot of changes in my wonderful and beautiful city. And Tbilisi is closer to Kuwait, Jerusalem, Istanbul, Bucharest, Kiev, and Baghdad than it is to Moscow. And if our friends, call them, Martians, hover their spaceships over Tbilisi and turn it around the point, Georgia's logical links to the outer world become rapidly evident. Turkey in the west, Iran in the south, energy-rich Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan in the east, Ukraine and Russia in the north. Georgia from this height is a classic crossroads. The South Caucasus, I would also add Central Asia to this configuration, is no longer only an extension of Russia's strategic space. Today, the South Caucasus and Central Asia are at the center of a new geopolitics that is profoundly different in its political, economic, and military dimensions, and hence its strategic implications, risks, and opportunities. Where Moscow was once the imperial center of the republics that become the new states, today Moscow is part of the later's distant periphery. Meanwhile, the new states are rapidly building relationship and the new strategic possibilities in the east, south, and the west, which are redefining their historically subordinate relationship to Russia. Though some Western analysts still tend to view these former borderlands through a Russian filter and to define their geopolitics in Russian terms of reference, this is not to say that one should ignore the importance of Russia in the affairs of the South Caucasus. Far from it. Russia is an important regional actor with interests in the Caucasus, but Russia is not the only regional power with the interest there. This is because Russia is losing the power to be the only and perhaps the dominant actor in the region, and because the South Caucasus interests are no longer strictly regional in the same way they were during the Soviet period, for two reasons. First, the concept of the South Caucasus as a region has grown to include much of Central Asia in the east, much of the Black Sea arena in the west, and extends toward the Middle East. Second, the South Caucasus states now negotiate politically and commercially far beyond their regions. For example, in the United States of America, Japan, Israel. This new interest will be symbolized by and embodied in the planned East-West Eurasian transport corridor that I mentioned, at the beginning of my talk, that will eventually link Central Asia to Europe via South Caucasus. The plan, spearheaded by European Commission, is to establish an alternative transport outlet to Europe which allow participating states to bypass the traditional and heavily overloaded route by Moscow. This many-sided project is clear in its objectives. It seeks to support the political and economic independence of the newly independent states and to enhance their access to European and world markets, and to strengthen regional cooperation among the participating states. It will rehabilitate and expand highways, railroads, seaports, airports from Tashkent to Batumi. It's a seaport on the Black Sea coast of Georgia, link the states of the new Silk Road with each other and to the outer world via the most modern and sophisticated communications and information technologies, and establish policies and plans to train personnel to make it all work in concert. The Euro-Asian corridor, which is intended specifically to offset Russia's historic dominance in the south, will undoubtedly give birth to military relationships and alliances that seek to protect it. This will draw in a number of countries where the U.S. currently has security relationships, for example, Turkey, where it hopes to develop security relationships with Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, maybe Georgia someday, and where it still has adversarial relationships, and Iran. I have in mind Iran. But in this respect, what I'd like to mention, we talked also very briefly with somebody from Iran, and I'd like to share with you my personal hope that in the near future, Americans will reopen Iran, because this is an incredible country. I have in mind, culture, education, science, people. There could have been, some certain political complications, but I hope that someday Americans will reopen Iran. And it's my personal opinion that when it happens, you could imagine what kind of changes, what kind of influences it will put on the political landscape of my region. How this reopening will change entire, Central Asia and Southern Caucasus. I talked just about Euro-Asian corridor and the South Caucasus, but the greater Central Asian region described above also will overlap and interact with the emerging greater Black Sea region. Like the East-West corridor, this grouping will also serve as a check on Russia's imperial ambitions, but it also worked to attract Russian participation as partner sharing in and benefiting from mutually derived profits rather than having to own and dominate territory and assets. It will center on the developing commercial and political relationships between Turkey, Ukraine and Georgia, but it may also include overlapping relationships and alliances that include Iran and Bulgaria, Romania. Like the Euro-Asian corridor, the Black Sea region will fertile soil for new strategic relationships. The notion that the South Caucasus states will be locked in Russia's economic web for the foreseeable future is dead. And without the associated notion that because of this dependency, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia remain Russia's strategic vassals by reorienting economically east, west, and south, the South Caucasus states now are acted upon in ways unknown for the most of the 20th century. More than anything else, economic opportunity has proved to be the catalyst of new strategic configurations and attachments. The geostrategic focus of these regions have been fundamentally changed because of energy. Oil and gas will be principal drivers of conflict in the South Asia's alternative futures, as world demand for oil could double in the next 25 years from 70 million barrels per day to as much as 140 barrels per day. Estimates of proven recoverable reserves in the Caspian range from 16 up to 32 billion barrels. The Caspian region is poised to become an oil and gas producing superpower, second to only to Persian Gulf in oil reserves, and the largest non-OPEC reserve. Whenever the flow of OPEC energy to international markets is interrupted, Caspian, and this is always possible if we look and follow the developments in different regions in Saudi Arabia or others, this is at least theoretical but a chance. If it happens, then Caspian and Central Asian oil will take a new importance for the West, especially in the context of increased demand and security of this energy supply. For me, at least, it's clear. To extract Caspian oil successfully and deliver it to international markets, energy companies will have to contend with the increasingly fluid and volatile political military environment of the Caspian Caucasus and its border regions. Pipelines for oil and gas raise important strategic questions because these routes require large amounts of terrain, because few routes are available, and because political control varies along these routes. Ethnic turmoil, as in Chechnya or in Afghanistan, could influence construction of pipelines and their operation. The Western, mostly the U.S. interest, and I think this could be the most interesting, point for at least for this audience, lie in helping to create stable environments for the exploration, extraction, transport, and marketing of energy. It is impossible to think strategically about the South Caucasus without acknowledging that its stability is central to safeguarding both the supply and transport of energy from the Caspian and Central Asia. Georgia's luck used to be, historically, and is now, and I hope will be, its geography. It is not rich in oil or diamonds or gold, at least not yet. Georgia rich is in its location. And our advantageous position between the Caspian and Black Seas offer enormous opportunities to play a pivotal role in the commerce of the region. How do we go about guaranteeing the security of Georgia and the South Caucasus? Let's speak frankly. Georgia's most constant worry comes from the north, from Russia. This huge and powerful state is experiencing unprecedented level of transformation, and it is conceivable. To be objective, I would like to admit that the entire South Caucasus is squeezed within three regional powers: Russia, Turkey, Iran. Each of these countries are undergoing through dramatic, sometimes painful transformations. And where shall we be the South Caucasus countries within the unstable, turbulent triangle Russia, Iran, Turkey, or triangle of stability and opportunities? This is not just an ideal rhetoric question. Let's talk a little bit more about Russia. You may expect our people, Georgians, who come from a country that was only recently part of Russia's colonial empire, to gloat at our former master's pain. But this is not the case, nor can it ever be so. Russia's stability is in everyone's interest, and nowhere in this stability is more desired than in the Caucasus. It is not just that Russia's capacity to act irrationally like it acted in Chechnya can be so destructive. Yes, we fear for the safety and integrity of our homes and families, and Russia's power to destroy is very great. But in Georgia's view, Russia's leaders must focus their attention on the tension that exists between their propensity to influence in the Caucasus and the actual nature of their interest there. Today, they are more concerned with influence than with interest, which one might expect from a colonial power that has lost an empire. But eventually, Sooner rather than later, Russian leaders must give interest priority over influence, or ultimately by establishing sound and viable interests in Georgia and elsewhere in the South Caucasus. Russia will learn to exercise a different kind of influence and different kind of power. Russia's interests will be served if Russia shares in the wealth and prosperity that a successful Georgia will create. This is why we welcome Russian commercial interests of all kinds. For example, Lukoil, which is, the huge oil company in Russia, and we shun Russian military presence in our states. We hope that Russians will soon learn the lessons of America, that economic interpretation is a great source of stability. We look with admiration on cities like Los Angeles, where Canadians, Saudis, Japanese and others own assets and thereby contribute to commercial and financial stability of California and the world. We Georgians will welcome Russia's owning assets in Tbilisi and joining in the commercial life of our nation. We will never welcome their troops and tanks. It is nobody's interest to disrupt Georgia's building success. It is in everyone's interest, especially Russia's, our immediate big neighbor, to participate fully in the success. And I think 1 year ago, I was interviewed by a very influential Russian newspaper, and they asked me some questions about Russia's interest in the region, and my answer, very brief answer I remember, was that it's in Russia's interest to have in Georgia, if we speak about Georgia, to have in my country a bank than a tank. And a couple of days later, a close friend of mine from Moscow and my wife and I spent in Moscow more than 22 years, and we have a lot of friends down there, a lot of friends. They're now in different positions, and one of them called me and told Tedo, we need both, to have both a tank and a bank. But I'm confirmed in belief that prosperity is indivisible. If Georgia succeeds, we'll carry others, including the Russians, with us. If Russia succeeds in its reforms, we too will benefit. Commercial successes in either country can only benefit the other. And when I speak about Georgia, Russia, I have in mind also success in Armenia, success in Azerbaijan, in Central Asian countries. Because, as I mentioned, prosperity is an indivisible thing. But if either of us fails, for whatever reason, the negative effects will be widely felt, and we can be certain that the foundation for success that have been laid elsewhere on our peripheries will be threatened. Security and stability are indivisible. All parts of the new South Caucasian security equation are related. Russia's stability is a key keeping the rest of our states healthy and prosperous, but it is not the only key. Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan have a history of cooperation among themselves and the region. We need to revisit that history rapidly and aggressively, for it is unlikely that any one of us can prosper alone. This is why the conflicts in the region are nagging sores in what otherwise should be a strong unity of the South Caucasus and Central Asia. Efforts by outsiders to exploit and manipulate with this division, could reach some kind of short-term, success, but in a long-term perspective, they will fail, because this will affect, if we speak about, for example, the problems we still have in Georgia. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, in Abkhazia, and just a week ago we just experienced again the new wave of refugees that they were kicked out from their own houses, and they are now living in different cities of my country. And I remember when this conflict started in 1994, how different forces inside Russia tried to manipulate with our problems. And we tried, and I remember being a national security advisor to President Japaridze, who jokingly, taking into consideration the very dramatic situation in Georgia, he used to call me a national insecurity advisor. And meeting his Russian counterparts, he tried to tell them, saying that please do not manipulate with our own problems, because this could backfire. You cannot, just manipulate here in Georgia and sit in front of TV sets in Moscow and say and speak with your friends, speaking, look at this, crazy people killing each other. This will come to your home, and this happened with Russia, unfortunately, in Chechnya. So you cannot contain, you cannot manipulate with problems, here, and think that you can contain, these problems, in some out of your territory. They will reach you. So that's why it's very important to understand it's very simple and at the same time very complicated, point. Georgia stands at the threshold of success. For us, this is more than creating more revenues by inviting investors, although this is certainly very important for us. Success for us is survival as a free and independent nation. We're convinced that our success and hence our survival is linked to our neighbors. And we're convinced that the West can play an important role in helping us achieve stability in the region. Without firm Western commitment to stability in the South Caucasus, there will be no security. Without security, there will be no peace. And without peace, there can be no future. As I mentioned above, Senator Brownback named the Euro-Asian corridor the corridor of freedom. And I again like to mention that it's a superb definition. Though, as I admitted above, it's a little bit too premature to refer to it this way. There are so many obstacles that I mentioned to you to overcome. And that's why maybe we could call these new developments, new trends, this new Silk Road, something like corridor of hope. Hope to preserve our freedom, our independence, our sovereignty. Hope to open wide the doors to commercial and trade opportunities that should bring stability and peace to all our countries. To open doors, and we open doors to Northrop Grumman, our very close and very dear friends who are trying to help my country to become just a normal country. So that's a very brief, a little bit maybe chaotic, but the country is the same way, story about my Georgia. Thank you very much.
The first question has to do with internal dissonance, and if you discuss that, and then second, the frictions with Armenia.
First of all, I'd like to start to answering your questions from the second one, because as I understand, you a little bit, confuse one point. We are not. It's not Armenia and Georgia fighting each other. It's Azerbaijan and Armenia fighting. Unfortunately. And historically, just to continue this, because historically we used to be mediating, and we have wonderful relationship with Armenia, and very, I should say, in a strategic relationship with Azerbaijan, and we're doing our best, though we have our own problems in a way to somehow to help these two very ancient nations to live in peace and and stability. In connection with your first question, Abkhazia is a historical and geographic part of Georgia. And Abkhazians and Georgians used to live together since ancient times. And when your kids and you, when you were young, used to go to school and study, for example, Golden Fleet, like a legend, it used to be part of my country's life. These activities took place on the territory of Georgia, on the territory of Abkhazia, when Jason kidnapped and captured Medea and Golden Fleet, and they took it away. But it was real historical life. It sounds like a legend in the United States of America. But now, due to certain reasons, you know how empire breaks down. They always try to have some kind of time bombs in different parts of the world, especially Soviet type of empire. And Abkhazia is one of these kind of time bombs. And when it disrupted and when empire dissolved, they triggered this bomb and it exploded. And as I mentioned in my talk, I did not mention exactly Russia, but certain forces in Russia, try to manipulate. It was for them, it's the way to keep, some interest and influence over Georgia, to manipulate with the problems. I do not say that we do not have some problems with the same Abkhazians. No, but we're historical neighbors. There are a lot of people, for example, who has a wife Abkhazian, husband is a Georgian, and vice versa. So there is no historical some reasons to fight and things like that. But trying to manipulate, with our problems, some forces outside my country try to keep control, with Georgia. It will be Armenia or Azerbaijan, and that's so. There's nothing strategic when we speak about conflict between Georgia and Abkhazia. We have some problems, but that's the life, and I hope that we're committed to solve this problem peacefully. We have some problems, and I should say that the participation in this very delicate and sensitive process of American administration is very active, and we appreciate this very much. But that's answer to your question.
Mr. Ambassador, I found many of the things you said very interesting, but I wonder if you might say a little bit more about the phrase you used earlier about the psychological transformation of Georgia. And I've wondered if you compare the state of mind of Georgia now compared to the days when it was under the rulership of Stalin. As I remember, Stalin was a Georgian. Was perhaps that a period when he would, because of that relationship, favor Georgia in the way he administered things? Were perhaps the people more secure and happy then, or would you say they're happier now? And finally, if there's some anxiety about the conflicts now, being a smaller nation, would they be happier, you think, in Georgia if there was a more effective international level of Republican structures of government to secure freedom there? So I'd like to hear your past and future thoughts about the happiness of Georgia.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. It's very interesting and a little bit. It's a very interesting question, but it could take a little bit. A little time, just to answer, but I'll try to make my answer short. First of all, Stalin, yes, he was born in Georgia, but he was a Soviet phenomenon. Stalin belongs not only to Georgia, but this person, this individual belongs to everybody in the Soviet Union. It's a typical Soviet phenomenon. When I speak about psychological and mental changes in my country, I have in mind not only Georgia, but it goes on in Russia. And when we speak about manipulations from outside, it's again, psychological, because certain people, certain group of people try try to, to use their influence to manipulate negatively. So it's again about psychology. And this imperial nostalgia is still alive. When we speak about Stalin and Georgia, I could say that you can find, it belongs to Georgia. I said that it belongs to Soviet, but it belongs to Georgia. It belongs to Georgia. You can find quite a number of people, especially from elder generation, and their opinion about Stalin, but it's a very small group of people, individuals, and their opinion about Stalin is just quite high. If you just ask me about Stalin, he was a historical figure, there is no doubt. You like it, you do not like. I personally do not like him, and I have some reasons why, because my family, my grandmother, spent 12 years in concentration camps. And my grandfather is being killed by somebody, in 1937, and he used to be one of the members of Communist Party, but he's been shot down, when he was just 28 or 29 years old. I never seen him, in my life. So I have my personal, reasons to dislike, this person and to dislike this system he created. When we speak about psychological transformation in my country and within the space of former Soviet Union, I should say that it is, in my opinion, when we speak about reforms, it's a very painful process. When we speak about creation of democratic institutions, it's very painful. But in my opinion, the most painful process is, change of psychology. Because we can, let's speak about Georgia and Ambassador of Georgia, and I can speak with you that Georgia is a sovereign state, independent member of the United Nations or different European nations, but still in our just everyday life, in our behavior, we are still Soviets. We still perceive the life, everyday life, through these black and white colors. We need some time. It takes generations, I think. Maybe my son, who is now, he's living with us and he's going to Chevy Chase in American school for 4 years. And by the way, he has no idea. He has historical knowledge who was Stalin. But he has absolutely no idea what kind of country Soviet Union used to be. Maybe this generation will be normal generation. But the psychological transformation, I think, is the most painful process, when we speak about these newly created states. And when we speak about conflicts and intervention and involvement of international institutions and different countries, because the only peacekeeping and peace-creating country now in the region is Russia. And it's a unique role because Russia creates problems and at the same time tries to solve the same problems. But we'll appreciate also very much if the international participation will be more active. We understand it's also a very painful process, but that's how we perceive the developments.
More. Mr. Ambassador, I think this has been quite an extraordinary evening. I think it's been unusually informative, and we're totally in your debt. Thanks so much.